Greetings to all of you. Thank you for joining us. And we are actually broadcasting both on Facebook Live as well as on Zoom. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. This is part of our local leaders forum that we have, of course, taken virtual as a result of COVID-19, where we're unable to offer these classes that we offer for our local leaders in our program. But this forum certainly has worked for us online, and it's really terrific that you could join us. Today, I have, of course, two wonderful folks who focus on the topic at hand, and hopefully we're going to talk about the topic at hand substantially different than what most people are accustomed to talking about waste. It gives me great pleasure to have, of course, my dear friend and colleague, Dan Mazmanian of the Price School at the University of Southern California, and of course, Susan Robinson of Waste Management Incorporated, one of the largest, of course, waste haulers in the nation. Greetings to both of you. Welcome.
Good afternoon, or good morning still.
Yeah, it's still good morning. It's still good morning. I would love to have a conversation with both of you about various topics about this, because most people out there do not think about waste the way I have thought about waste. As when I was first elected in 2003, one of my first responsibilities was to hire a waste hauler for the city of Rolling Hills Estates. I even joke by saying that I think I have a PhD in waste, because I spent about a year to go to various waste haulers and landfills, learning about waste, learning about recycling, etc. Never did I think that one day I'd be talking about ultimately how important waste is to the topic of sustainability. So I'm going to start with you, Dan, to please set the stage for us, because a lot of folks, as I said, they think about waste as something you throw out. Never think about how this equates to sustainability, the climate change topic, and how does that fit in the discussion?
Okay, what I want to say, Frank, is I appreciate this introduction, and the fact is, what I work on is called sustainability, but what that means, I've learned, is different for different people, and how it relates to what we're talking about, waste. Well, actually, it's intimately related. I will try and explain that if you go back 30 years, we used to talk about the 3 E's, which is economy, environment, and equity, as a way to address serious environmental challenges in ways that actually, if you think of a Venn diagram, come together with issues of economic development and equity and justice. But in the 1990s, excuse me, the issue of the existential threat of climate change became paramount in the environmental community, and it in fact has direct influences on our ecosystem, but also our economic environment and the human population on the planet. So sustainability turned out to be the overriding thematic phrasing of what is considered to be sustainable development in an economic sense, sustainable equity and justice in a social sense, and a more continuous, stable, natural and human environment for people. So sustainability, as we talk about it today, encapsulates this broad issue. You can call it, as the United Nations does, through 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or in business today, you can talk about the environment, social, and governance investing, which is the ESG, which is many businesses are thinking about very seriously, about social responsibility. Sustainability starts with the existential climate threat, and then how it plays out across all these dimensions, and how, critically, do we bring them together? How do we think about waste in the context of this existential threat? And I believe that's our conversation today. It's about the environment, it's about health, it's about the transformation in our broader system. And that's where the sustainability fits in this conversation.
Well, thank you, Dan. And I want to jump to Susan now, who happens to be actually the Director of Sustainability at Waste Management, one of the most progressive firms on the topic of waste. And Susan, in that discussion, I think the two words that come to mind and people talk about on a regular basis is zero waste. Now, and that's important, but the question then becomes, is this really achievable? And frankly, maybe my follow-up question would be to allow you to go beyond, is to talk about what waste management is doing to be able to achieve this for the communities that we all serve.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really been interesting. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. This is really, I think, it's been fun thinking about the dialogue, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And I think it's really relevant. It's always been relevant. I think about my years working in local communities, that, as you started out with, Frank, that we would come in and we would talk about sustainability goals, and within about 3.5 minutes, we'd be talking about recycling. And so we think so often about it, and I think it's because it's so tangible to each of us. It's so personal. We can see it, we can feel it, we feel like we can impact it. And as I heard one sustainability director say, it's really making visible the invisible. And that's really what we're doing here. We're talking about the entire circle, the entire circular economy, and it starts with using less raw materials. So we talked to your question about zero waste. Zero waste is a really important aspirational statement. And you need aspirational statements. You think about how many companies have them, how many cities have them. The reality is waste is probably a part of life in every part of the world, the globe, and waste exists. And I think also in some cases, at least at some points in time, the reason that we in the US have invested in a waste management system is because of human health and the environment. So we have to remember sometimes in our zealousness to avoid waste, to go to zero waste, we create an unintended consequence that may not have an environmental benefit. And we'll talk about that, I think, as a net environmental benefit. And I think we'll talk about that more in the next hour or so. But I think we've started to kind of replace the notion of zero waste with the notion of circularity. And that notion of circularity aspires to keeping things in motion so that we do not end up with that off stream into the waste sector. I think we recognize that will happen, that zero waste, that's why it's kind of been redefined as like 90%. And it's really finding ways to reduce the use of virgin raw materials. I always need to start out, and then I'll pause. I need to start out by saying really the place that we're trying to get to is not using virgin resources, raw materials. That's where the benefit is when we talk about the waste management system. It's not the end of life disposal. It's not using those resources in the first place. So every time we keep something in motion and use it again, we're avoiding having to use more virgin resources. And that's really what our goal is, to do that both from the recycling perspective and the organics perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to those resources question in a second. But Dan, there is a perfect example at USC about zero waste that definitely, the president appointed you to head up a task force about this issue. But as far as I know, one of our facilities, which happens to be Coliseum, I think, is really endeavoring to do this. Talk about that for just a second. At
Sure.
the Coliseum and what USC is doing under your leadership.
Well, it's not under my leadership, under the university's leadership. But yes, I'll explain. First of all, I just want to follow up on what Susan said. Once again, how to think about this is a big issue. I refer to that old phrase, cradle to grave. If you really want to be serious about this, the things that Susan touched on are within a cradle to grave spectrum. What are the materials we use, humans, from our natural environment? Then we go to procurement, which is how do we decide what we buy? Then we go to, as she touched on, the 3 R's, which is reuse, repurpose, recycle, all of which are organized around the thought of cradle to grave. We don't want to dump them on the land at the end, and we don't want to dump them in the oceans at the end of our human use of these products. And so this is why it's called zero waste. Now, in terms of USC, Susan also helped because she defined 90% avoidance of landfill as success. And USC, actually for the last now, in the second year of this, has had what is called 100% recycling of all materials used, all food and products used at any football game, USC football game, in the Coliseum. How does it do that? Well, it doesn't go to the raw materials, but it does go to anybody who has a concession at the Coliseum, hot dogs, beer, trinkets, whatever, to go to, we actually review their procurement to see that based on what we know, we as a university know, is the least harmful material you could use to have your product. And we also ban some things like single-use plastics and so on. So we got some rules that you cannot have a concession at the Coliseum without following the procurement rules. That's a big job because you have to, at the beginning, and also it's inspected every single game. Someone walks around to every single concession and checks this. So it takes a lot of work. Okay. 2, that at the end of every game, there is a crew, typically 24 people are hired by the university routinely after every game to sort every piece of what we'll call waste, but anything that goes into a waste receptacle or is going to be carried away to a dump site and sorts out for purposes of reuse, repurpose, or recycle. And in fact, they have achieved about a 93% success rate, which is 100% renewable, zero waste for purposes of conversation. That means only about 7% of what actually enters the Coliseum ends up going to a waste site, okay? But that's a huge effort with some very important parameters, which is the university controls everything that comes onto the campus. Yeah. So if you take the Coliseum, we have it cordoned off just to enter. We have it cordoned off the same way for anybody who brings anything to sell onto the Coliseum. I mention that because we're also going to Galen Basketball Arena to do the same starting this year, maybe in the fall, for basketball games. So in Coliseums or arenas where we can control what comes on, it's much more difficult, and Susan knows this better than I think you worked elsewhere than SC, to control all the food and products and materials that come onto any given open campus, which is what we have, to any given school or program that they purchase. This is a huge issue in any event. That's the USC experience today. And we're getting ahead, but USC has a zero waste goal now that's percolating up through our planning process to be the goal for the university.
Well, that's a great case study. That's why I asked you. So that brings up the issue of the supply chain issue, right? So Susan, coming back to you, what, if anything, that you're doing from your perspective, and how are you influencing the supply chain? And I'll give you a perfect example. I don't know if people watch this, but I watch with great interest Apple launches, and I don't own any stock in Apple, by the way, or I'm not promoting necessarily Apple products, but Apple launches are very, very interesting, how they focus on sustainability, how they focus on environmental stewardship, etc. This new product, for example, they're putting out, they're taking things away from the box that you're buying because of the argument that supply chain matters, and most of the world has those little plugs that, Apple chargers, so they're not putting the Apple chargers anymore, or they're not putting these things anymore because most people have them, for example. So talk about, Susan, the supply chain aspect of this and what waste management is doing to influence that.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting discussion. I'll start with just a little anecdote. In about 2013, we started to realize that we were part of the packaging supply chain. Previous to that, about 40% of what we had was newspaper. And so we didn't really think about in terms of the recyclables in the recycling cart being packaging. But as the newspaper volume disappeared, quite frankly, we realized that we are part of the packaging supply chain. So we started really engaging with CPG companies, all those companies that make products and packaging. And we actually do a lot of consulting with them. And I would even say increasingly over the last 3 to 5 years ago, as they have developed really aggressive, you just look at goals that any of your favorite brands have. They have goals for recyclability. They have goals to use recycled content. So they actually approach us and we work with them. We're part of many national organizations. That's how I spend a lot of my time. Actually, I'm on the board of a large national packaging organization, working with companies to help them kind of understand our collective role. We're all part of this same supply chain. So we consult to them. We get samples of products. We take them on tours of our facilities so they can understand those products, what it means if somebody's trying to recycle them. We help them understand the glues, the inks, the size, the shape, the markets for those materials. So we really try to be proactive, helping them understand the role in manufacturing their products as well. The one other note that I'll make, we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years looking at the notion of life cycle thinking and life cycle assessment. And so also helping folks understand from municipal customers at the state level, really important for some of the state policy decisions being made, that important role of packaging versus product and protecting the product is where the environmental benefit is in the product itself, not the package. That's just what we're left with. So you need to always remember to, one, reduce and not buy things you don't need. Not buy packaging you don't need, and then also make sure that you're protecting the product as well. So it's a very complex supply chain. And one final note that became really, really obvious, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about this in a little bit during COVID, when we all went to the grocery store and we saw empty shelves. We actually, in early March, started getting calls from our largest paper mills, and they were in a panic, and they were just pleading with us to make sure that we would continue to collect recyclables at the curb, because they needed the fiber to make the boxes, to make the products that we needed on those store shelves. That was a big aha moment in our industry, and one that really got not only our companies, but also our regulators and elected officials to understand the important role of recycling in that supply chain.
So if I may chime in on that before you go on, Frank.
Go ahead.
Susan, it's a wonderful example, because what we're really talking about here is you're helping integrate the life cycle into a business plan, not just your own, but yours, of course, but you and all those who you work with in the whole supply system. And that's the kind of comprehensive thinking that's going to change the way we do things. Because too often, if we simply regulate and say to, let's just say, small business, they must X, it's very difficult. It's easy to say and hard to do because the rest of the system isn't in sync. And what we're working at USC, because we're large, but what you do as a business is make it part of the life cycle of the operation of what you. So we're not doing the recycling in the Coliseum to save money at USC per se, although we're saving some on waste. It is actually to be part of an integrated system where we provide the incentive, which is you can sell at USC if you follow our rules. So there's every part, and then when it leaves, the question to ask is, where does it haul off to? This is your comment about life cycle. We have to think of this as a dynamic process for which the waste itself has historically been thought of something we throw away.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that's inefficient.
Yeah, that's precisely the issue. That's why I started the conversation with saying that, look, my eyes were open years ago that this is not the case at all when you're looking at waste. But segueing perhaps, Susan, coming back to you, you talked about the supply chain from a business perspective, but what about the behavior of people? The end of the supply chain. What about me that I'm throwing stuff out? What do I need to know, and how do I change that behavior in order to fit in this so-called supply chain?
I'm gonna go to the other end of this first. I'm gonna start with, what do you need to do to buy products And what does the university need to do to buy products that are made with post-consumer content? So we're creating the demand for that material. And that's something we've historically not done very well. We focused on supply, making sure we're diverting it from landfill, putting it in the recycling bin, and then it kind of goes away and we feel good about it. You know, that's that individual behavior. We feel like we've done something, so we don't have to feel guilty about buying more things. The fact of the matter is we need to first think about, you know, to your point of individual behavior is, what am I doing to help support recycling? And how am I behaving to make sure that I am doing the right thing? So we like to say it's no longer just about putting the right thing in the recycling cart, but we do need to talk about putting the right thing in the recycling cart. And one of the things we've learned over time is the role of education and the role of, it's community-based social marketing. And if you're familiar with the term, it's really kind of, you do what people around you and your peers do, and making sure, one, community spend enough money to educate, and then we provide that kind of environment where people are truly looking at what other people do, and becomes part of the norm of what you're expected and what everybody's expected to do. And that's when we see the shift happen. One of the really interesting challenges of recycling, different from electricity, different from water. You can engineer electrical efficiencies. You can engineer water efficiencies. You can't engineer behavior around solid waste. It all starts with a decision that we make at our desk or in our kitchen about what container we put our waste in and what happens to it. And so it is a lot harder than people thought it would be. We haven't spent enough money, enough time, enough thinking about how to do it right. Those communities that do have good, robust programs, so we have a huge opportunity to do a better job there on that individual perspective you bring up.
You know, Susan, if I can follow up on that, what came to mind as you're speaking is the state of California has now a rule about plastic bags. Now there's a lot of frustration about that, paper versus plastic and so forth. But so there's a level here where we actually impose rules, going to Frank's question of behavioral change. We're not asking people if they should change their behavior and if they'd be so kind as to do so. We're saying we consider this a public value, and we're going to change the rules to constrain, frankly, and direct your behavior. Then the question is this cost effective? Do I pay or do you pay? Or does someone else pay? But it's so Frank, changing individual behavior is difficult to start with. Two, you do need education and options that are realistic. So if you tell someone in Los Angeles today they must take public transit, and you don't provide that public transit, that's cheap talk. If you tell people today they can't buy water in a plastic bottle and they don't have an alternative that's cost effective, it's cheap talk. Well, so now we come back to cradle to grave. How do we provide the water in a way that's convenient, that doesn't cost the same? And now we're going to a variety of ways of doing it in water on campus and elsewhere. But you think of every single product. Susan mentioned about the procurement side of this, the demand, creating the demand. SC has 300 different points of procurement at our university. We know the number now. We just figured out how many different entities at USC has the authority to purchase. Now, how do you coordinate that and instill this new social consciousness about it? Honestly, we're trying, but it's not so simple. And because there's some things where you can readily change the product you're purchasing at the same cost, and others you can't find another product right now. So this is a systemic issue we're dealing with the long-term effect of cradle to grave, life cycle analysis, for the sake of the environment, for the sake of our health. So
that brings me to my next question, which I am also looking at the questions, and one of my beloved former students has wrote a comment and a question, and I think very legitimately asking the question, how can technology, especially major companies, I gave the example of Apple doing something right, although she brings up the point that, well, what about the fact that Apple produces new phones almost every other year, and what happens to the old phones? I mean, which is totally legitimate in asking. Again, I'm not promoting Apple, I'm just giving an example of Apple doing something right, but there's a bunch of other things that presumably Apple is doing wrong. I don't know. What can the technology side do in order to actually promote more disposal or recycling of technology, Susan?
So I guess I'd start with saying, do we all need to buy a new Apple phone every year, every couple of years? That's probably the first question that needs to be asked. We all love our Apple. We love our Apple products. I'm not trying to make a judgment there, but I think I'm going to stick with my theme, which is the reduction, reuse. There's a lot of resources that go into Apple products, or any computer, any product. And I do think there's a lot of work that's being done, if my memory serves me, and others might know this more than I, but there's a lot of work being done to source those materials in a more environmentally correct way. Renewable energy, certainly a lot of the technology companies are using, they're big energy users. And then resource products in a sustainable way is a really big drive as well. So though, you think about it's the example of the USC managing its supply chain from what's purchased at the football games, the products that are used. We do the same at our Phoenix Open. It's the largest sporting event in the world, and we monitor the purchasing of the products so they're sustainable, can be reused and recycled. That's the key in that technology space. There's a lot of technologies going on in our industry as well. I will also say everything from the fleet technology to make sure that it's a renewable fuel being used, to there's a lot of development for being done really by the petroleum companies right now for how they can take plastics, particularly at the end of life, and process them to be able to use those again, that material again. So there is a lot of room for technology, and I think we've just touched on various places within that supply chain, from the manufacturing to the processing. We use a lot of optical sorting and robotics in our processing, to the end market, turning it back into products that we can make again. So we have a lot of opportunity to really engage in the growing space of technology at various points along that value chain in our industry.
Frank, I don't follow that very closely in detail, but one has to be impressed if you follow the various literatures on this sustainability and climate change about the rapid pace of technology transformation that's underway in so many ways, some out of the labs that I've never imagined would happen. I'm not in that space, and others that are very practical. I want to just give you an example, however. You mentioned iPhone, but it's more than that. In Europe, cars have to be designed for disassembly.
Mm-hmm.
That means that you can't really meld a piece of plastic to a piece of metal. You have to have them disassemblable. That's the word. With the intent of recycling or repurposing and basically recycling in the car. So you can say that there are some ways that policy can help think through. And one is to simply say design for disassembly, so that even the iPhone, while there may be too many, or we talk about a disposable society, and one of them is having a product that doesn't last very long, or you've changed the technology, so you want to upgrade it. That's the phone. That you may have to actually have some public policies that give you parameters. And one is, an example is design for disassembly as a parameter. Do whatever you want, but you better be able to take it apart and tell us where it's going to go. And others would be different than that. There is a new biomaterial that is the future replacement for plastics. If it's biodegradable, we're not going to probably be so concerned about the single-use plastics, because they are biodegradable, whereas today they're not. And so that affects the oceans, that affects the land, that affects the methane coming out of old landfills. So it seems to me that there's an enormous area for technology, and I have been impressed by students that I have just encountered at USC whose minds are already there. They don't have to be educated on the ideas. They're excited about being the new innovators. And by the way, back to Susan's business, obviously I've known a little bit about waste management for 30 some years, and followed it somewhat at a distance, but fascinating as it's changed its business model. And that business model now, you heard her say, is integrate into the cradle to grave, because there is a business niche for us in that cradle to grave. We can profit by you doing better and we doing better if we work together. That's a very different attitude, and that's a very different business model than when I first encountered what it was then, chem waste, but waste management. And that's what we have to think about. How do you create a system where the cradle to grave is part of a conversation in society and in business and in communities writ large? So we're all on the same team on this.
So Dan, are you describing what some have called the circular economy or the circularity, so to speak? If so, in your examples of detaching things, etc., for example, if so, is that any different than zero waste?
Zero waste simply gives you a goal that puts you into the conversation about life cycle analysis and about circular economy. Why would you get into that conversation unless someone said, well, you can't just leave it on the land. You can't just dump it. Then you say, what am I going to do? Well, then you start, as Susan so well described, you start to backward mapping of what this means. So if you're hauling the waste, you better backward map into who's giving you their waste and what the components are. And then, as Susan described again, you might want to talk to those people to say, we'll help you get there because we know this takes knowledge, this takes education. We happen to have that expertise. We're going to help you so you can still produce your goods. As I said, design for disassembly. You can still build your cars. We're not saying get out of your car, although we do want to make it electric today because of climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. But we understand the individual automobile still, and so but design it for disassembly.
Yeah.
And that's the circular economy when you start thinking that way. The big political question is that the responsibility of government through fiat? Is that the responsibility of corporations in terms of simply managing their own business? Is that the responsibility of you and me, Frank, choosing what we buy based on what they tell us about the product? A disclosure of a life cycle analysis of something we're buying.
That's a great question.
We have all kinds of rules on each one of those. There is no comprehensive strategy. So you can't put toxic materials in the waste stream in California because it might pollute our underground aquifer, and that's against the law. So you have to tell people, well, that's skull and crossbones on anything that will have that effect. Well, that took that out of the market. People didn't put that in the market anymore because they didn't like the skull and bones on their product. So it's a small rule, but some things are forcing, but others are economic incentives and others are creativity because we're on the same team. And that requires a paradigm. And the paradigm is either cradle to grave or circular economy.
Yeah. So Susan, I mean, I'm going to ask you about cost and et cetera, but let me come back to what Dan was asking specifically and see it from your perspective. How do you see this, and what strategies do you see to be effective in response to what Daniel was, for example, talking about? I presume there is a level of a balancing act here as to what government can do and the private sector can do and everybody else can do. But how about that from your perspective at Waste Management?
Yeah, I was thinking when he was talking that, yeah, it's all of the above. And I'm going to use an example that kind of links the last couple of points together, which is textiles. So clothing right now, it's an increasing portion of the waste stream. I'm believing it's one of the, other than food, I think it's the largest single portion of the waste stream that we're finding these days, with burning other things. So it's a big portion of the waste stream. And those folks that make that clothing in particular are under a lot of pressure. The notion of fast fashion has become one that's a real lightning rod, and there's a lot of effort around that. And so a couple of points that we're talking about here. Business and industry who are manufacturing those products are taking a step to take them back, to design better for reusability, recyclability. Some of them have really difficult materials, though. There are a lot of different multi-types of materials that can't be easily recycled. France has a law. Okay, so there's the companies taking a role in thinking about their supply chain, how they can take the material back. They're investing in technologies to recycle those materials again. And sometimes the petroleum products, so different kinds of recycling there. You've got France, okay, then the policy piece of it that said, you can't take your clothes that you don't sell at your store and you can't throw them away. You have to find another use for that. So there's a policy that then drives business to do more. And then there's our individual role is to think about what we need, what we buy. Then when we're done with it, when we want to get rid of it, where we take it for disposal. So there's a role for each of those. Interestingly enough, one of the things we've done as a company, we've identified textiles as a growing part of the waste stream, and we've invested in those technology companies that are recycling the materials. So we're actually engaging in the business side to be able to help find ways to collect the material and then to turn it back into new products as well. So there's a lot of different touch points there. We all play a role in finding a way to have that, to really mitigate the impact, the environmental impact of the materials in the stream.
See, that's up and downstream. That's what she's talking about, up and downstream. You know, we also, something that everybody probably doesn't think about in this world, but way back 30 years ago, we have a deposit and return on soft drinks. People forget about the bottle and cans. But in fact, that was one of the ideas here about recycling. You don't just throw it away. How do we get people, you and me, and everyone we know, to stop simply throwing it away? Say, we put a price on it. And by the way, it's a deposit and return. You pay it when you buy. That's the deposit. The return is when you return it. Now, we have a problem in California that system is not at the level that it was when it was initiated. Part of it, I think, is price, which is we've seen inflation, but 5 and 10 cents on a can doesn't motivate the way it used to. But we've thought about these things in the past, but we don't have, as in Susan's context, we don't have every name your clothing store required to take back their product. Because I buy a pair of Levi jeans and I pay a deposit on it. And I've got to return it at the end of life to Levi. What does Levi do? Levi's going to worry now about what's going to be the next purpose and use of that material. We're incentivizing Levi, we're incentivizing me, but we are creating some cumbersome processes. What if Levi goes out of business? Or what if I wear them for 10 years and they're not worth much anymore? Why should Levi have to go? Well, that was the same deposit and return problem we've had. Grocery stores not wanting to do it anymore. It's not cost effective for them. But we have ways we've dealt with this. I actually like the way Susan's describing their business as the model, which is think about it and find the centers of innovation and profit, so it becomes part of a business model, not something prescribed that's seen as punitive.
I'd like to give you an example of that too. This is, your point, Dan's a really good one. So we talk a lot about creating demand for materials and products to pull material through the system. One of the things we've done in the last year, two specific things. One is we've signed on to a program called the Demand Champions Program, where we commit to buy products made with post-consumer content. So our recycling carts, the garbage cans and carts you see on your streets, we're now beginning to have them made with the same material we collect from the curb, and it's going back into making those. And we're in the process today, we're back on the textile discussion, is we are purchasing uniforms for our employees made with PET plastic bottles that we're collecting in our programs. So we're really trying to drive that circularity, starting with our own, doing what we need to be doing, which is buying products that we need to use on our procurement department and making sure that we're using the same material that we're collecting from our customers.
And I'm just going to jump ahead to SC, because SC can't control the production of things that we don't do the manufacturing and construction. We just buy. So we do it through our procurement. We're one step down the line. We're not at your step of being innovative in terms of the products. We're saying, but we'll buy the innovative product. And so we're a purchaser of that kind of thinking. As most people are individually, we're purchasers of the products.
So that brings me to the cost conversation a little bit, because I think that's important. And I will tell you that years ago, my dear friend Susan Moulton at Waste Management, who came to me when I was actually evaluating various programs, and taught me a very good lesson about cost. And that is, we had to change my city, for example, was doing okay on recycling, and we were barely making 949 requirements through the use of our manure. We're an equestrian community, etc. So we're kind of almost there, but not there. All of a sudden, we changed policy. The policy became people paid for what they threw out. We gave them free of charge recycling bins and green waste bins, especially when recycling, of course, the recycling world has changed now, but at the time, recycling was a big deal. We gave them free of charge, and we said, you're going to pay on the basis of what you throw out. So the bigger the bin, the more money you're going to pay. All of a sudden, our compliance rate skyrocketed, and we're now among the better cities in California in actually diverting from the landfill under that requirement, for example, with the help of waste management. So for me, the issue of cost is important, and Dan touched on it. Susan, what about cost? What about the circularity issue? What about zero waste? But what about cost? Because at the end of the day, if the consumer does not see a benefit or see some sort of a checkbook effect, we talk about voting always by your pocketbook, right? What about waste with your pocketbook?
Yeah, you bring up a great point. I've always lived in a community that has what we call pay as you throw. So we have always had very small garbage containers and we have very large yard waste and food waste and recycling containers. And I've always said I've implemented programs in a variety of different communities, and you have to have the cost component. You'll get a certain number of people who will comply because it's the right thing to do. But unless you add the cost component, really you can't have that broad success. And you need to add the enforcement component as well. A municipality needs to establish policies that really send the message to the customer that they're serious, that this is really what we're going to do. And sometimes it's very hard, Frank, as you know, from an elected official perspective, to do that. In some parts of the country, it's not popular at all. Some parts of the country individuals don't pay for their garbage at a rate. It's included in their tax base. And so it's very unpopular to add any visible costs around the waste disposal, et cetera. And so those areas tend to not do as well. And so I think you touched on it really perfectly to really highlight the difference you saw when you have control over that material and what you're doing. Now we need to make sure that there is an element of enforcement so we don't see more trash going to recycling and in the yard waste, because that happens without that enforcement, definitely. The other thing that I think I have to acknowledge as well is that the cost of recycling has gone up quite a bit. And so we are, I think seeing some communities challenged with how to accommodate that cost. But at the end of the day, really it's when we can adequately compensate for the economics around disposal and avoided disposal, we will by far end up with a better compliance. And over the long term, we're going to save money. There is no way around it that we aren't going to save money. I think not everybody looks at the whole package of goods to see at the end of the day where we end up, which is a net benefit. And you have to factor in the environmental benefits as well. Sometimes we just forget that. And it's so important that right now it's really tough with budgets after COVID. It's going to be really hard. And I think it's going to be very important that policymakers are able to convey, and we as service providers can convey the benefits to customers of staying with the program. Let's invest in the right places, because at the end of the day, it's the best solution for our environmental, our social, and for our community programs.
I couldn't agree more with what Susan has described, but I want to bring up a point about cost that was touched on when you mentioned enforcement, which is, where do we apply the benefits and where do we apply the costs? And if the benefits are accrued to your community, Frank, because you converted, but the costs are added to an individual's direct cost, that individual may be tempted, as Susan alluded to, pouring their garbage that is going to go to a waste site in with their green or their recyclables, because they have more than fits in their can. So we have a per there. And if you think about this on a larger scale, last year we had a crisis in this whole chain when China refused to take we'll call waste from the United States in certain categories. Some of it is the technology waste. Others of it was glass and plastics, and so I mean plastics rather, because in fact what we were doing is exporting our waste, not and recycling it somewhat, but an enormous amount of pollutants resulted in their communities, toxic pollutants and others. So part of it is, to what extent are we going to, and we haven't done very well at this in the United States, we've tried, shipping our waste to someone else. And that's going on across state lines, across county lines right now. So, how do you manage that system in a way of both rules and pricing and enforcement that gets you the authentic results you're looking for? Part of this, I think, we haven't mentioned it, but it has to do with California's requirement of recycling at every community. And what we see is the slippage in actual compliance because of these problems in terms of what's actually ending up in the waste cycle. So I just want to bring up, part of this is where we apply the cost and who gets the benefits. And we just have to get through.
Yeah, I hear you. And in fact, we've addressed some of this, by the way. First of all, this conversation is a perfect example of when we say all politics are local. I've always said sustainability is local. I know everybody talks about the big topic, the world and the nation, etc. But this conversation proves how important sustainability and the get there. We need the local effort. And from an enforcement standpoint, Dan, for example, I know that Waste Management has a technology, for example, on their trucks to be able to see when they're dumping individual actually bins, who's threw out what. Not necessarily to become like, nosy in the privacy of people, don't get me wrong. We're not, legislating people or whatever, but we do have mechanisms to enforce all of that. Plus, let me say the importance of this. When we changed policy, we had about 8 or 9 sessions over the entire course of a year of public sessions to educate the public of my city about what we're overall attempting to accomplish. Don't underestimate the power of education, especially with people, when you explain the reasons as to why you're doing things. And you and I are in the education business, Dan, and we know how important education is. But I trust people doing the right thing when they're properly educated and when they know what they're doing.
I didn't know that, Frank. Susan, I didn't know that. I am delighted to hear it. I don't know if that's used for enforcement or just knowledge on the part of waste management. And you're talking about behavioral change now. We're back to behavioral change. And we didn't dwell on this, but education is critical. And what comes to my mind, in practice, I've noticed the greatest education in the communities I've lived in and the neighbors I've had. The education starts in many ways with the children,
right?
And in schools.
Absolutely.
And the children I've seen, and we're talking about 8, 10, but through their teens, are the ones who really become incensed at what their own family is doing or what they see in their report, because they understand this is their future in many ways, their future, and they just simply can't believe about our antiquated notions of how we run our lives, which is we just throw stuff on the ground that we don't use anymore. Right. And they don't even walk through the economics of it. They just, as a moral point of view,
absolutely,
it's reprehensible. So education is critical, not just with your citizens in terms of this, but also scaling up what you've just said is a real challenge, right? Just Los Angeles, 4 million people are going to go through this educational experience. I don't know. I actually bank more on the larger scale entities involved in this, from the production to the procurement to the hauling, under some guidelines that are policy guidelines than I do about trying to change every individual behavior. It's really tough.
We have about 10 minutes left in the conversation, and I'm encouraging everyone who's online with us to submit their questions. I'm happy to put it to our panelists. Please do put your questions in the Q&A session. So I want to come back, Susan, to something you mentioned, and of course, I want to close with that. I mean, how could we not mention COVID in a COVID era as it relates to our topic? So let me start with you, Susan. How is COVID affecting you, waste management as a whole, as an organization, as well as, as what you do in the scheme of waste management and sustainability?
Yes, I appreciate you asking that. So I'm going to do two things. I'll say, I'm going to start with a broad look. So you mentioned China and what's going on with China's policies, international policies. They created about 3 years ago some real shift in our business. And the reason I bring it up is it really impacted us when COVID hit. So we don't export material anymore. We don't export any plastics anymore. And most of our fiber stays domestic as well. So to that point of being local, we've become more local. We are managing material with a lot more technology, more efficiently and with more technology. That was really important. We've kind of suffered through some economic hardship, and we've invested in efficiencies and in technology to be able to meet we have less demand for our material, so we have to produce a high quality material. So we put a lot of investment in our systems, which made us better equipped to react to COVID. So in early March, we did a couple of things. We moved 20,000 of our employees home, which most of them had never worked at home before. So we had to go buy new computers and get people set up on the internet and get people shifted to home. We told all of our full-time hourly employees we would pay them for full-time employment through the course of COVID, and we've continued to do that, our hourly employees. And we adjusted our operations to make sure that we were providing all the right safety protocols, keeping people distance, everything we needed to do to comply with all CDC guidelines at every point along the way. So really, and this is where I think the notion of the ESG comes in. Our strong governance that we have as a company helped us to be able to react quickly and strongly to take care of our employees and our communities and our customers. And we actually have been able to transition through. We had a huge shift, if you can imagine. Our commercial business kind of disintegrated for a while, and our residential business basically increased by about 20% at periods of time, which means we had a lot more waste and recyclables at the curb, a really different mix of our material we've had to adjust to, shifting our cost structure quite dramatically. That hasn't fully shifted back. Certainly some areas it's very geographically different. So we've had to react according to different places across the country. It's really been, for us, I always say we're kind of an interesting line of sight into what's going on around the community, because we can see where economies are strong, who's coming back with COVID. So it's been interesting. I think, just to kind of close it out to say what COVID's done for us, I think, is realize, one, the importance of recycling, the importance of, just reminding us of the importance of valuing our employee safety and our community programs, our recycling programs, and that technology investment is really critical for us as we're looking to the future. You just think about all the things that were potential problems for us as we had more automated collection, more automated sorting in our facilities to our end markets, really have been able to adapt very well. So we're very, we are, not done with it certainly, but we've adapted on the way through and have every expectation of making us stronger out the back end.
Dan, what do we learn from COVID in the sustainability?
Well, the experiences at the opposite end of the scale. We haven't had as much waste generated because we haven't been on campus. Mm-hmm. And so basically we simply dramatically reduced our waste flow and shifted it to the urban that Susan is dealing with at homes and so forth. We haven't responded to COVID so much because of that, but what is happening is, which is unrelated to actually COVID or climate change, is we have a new president. And so new President Carol Folt has really is one who's made sustainability a major initiative of the entire university that is leading to the changes that we've had examples of. I mentioned the Coliseum on terms of procurement, management, and waste, but throughout the university, in all these ways, thinking about the life cycle consequences of all that we do. And so, but it's not our conversation today, but SC is going to look very differently in a couple of years than it has in the past around these themes, because now they're becoming incorporated into the culture of the university. You mentioned I'm the chair of her working group on this issue. It really is affecting research, education, particularly operations on campus, very different orientation with goals, which Susan began with. We've got some ambitious goals now for transforming the university and making it more sustainable, for which recyclable waste management and procurement are critical dimensions. We've just enrolled in the STARS program, which really is creating now a metric for the use of all materials at the university across some 24 categories and so forth. So we're now joining the national and international kind of reporting, scorekeeping community at USC. We hadn't been a part of STARS before now.
And that, Dan, that will be up, because I noticed the question earlier, that would be applicable throughout campus, right? It's not just...
Oh, it is the campus-wide. All of this is
okay.
Campus-wide.
Yeah, very cool. Susan, maybe the last few minutes that we have, and again, I encourage questions of the audience, but biodegradables and food was a big deal number of months ago, and of course COVID hit, and restaurants and everybody else closed, and the focus kind of shifted a little bit. Where are we in terms of that with respect to the larger scale of collection of food, especially at the restaurants, et cetera, and what is Waste Management doing with that? And are there any provisions of law that you foresee that we're going to see in the near future?
Yeah, that's a great question. California, I will say, is in a very different place than the rest of the country. There are very few places in the country that are actively managing organics the way the West Coast does, Washington, Oregon, and California. There are some commercial programs in some cities more than states. Massachusetts actually, though, has a very aggressive organics diversion program. And it's a really tough material to handle. This is one where we actually do analyses for our commercial industrial customers to help them reduce first, because organics are so expensive to handle. Our customers don't like dealing with them either. So it's better to avoid the waste in the first place, especially from the commercial sector, but at our homes as well. Figure out how to buy less, use it, not have to dispose of that organic material. So again, I would say if anything, organics is the first place that we should be all looking to reduce that material. That's part one. And what we're doing, Waste Management actually has some really neat, aggressive organics management programs in place. In fact, I was just reading this morning about we have one in the Bay Area and then one in the LA that's responding to our needs in LA in particular, which is basically taking organics, sending it to a company that's using it to create power. So there's a lot of effort happening, and California is the leader in this, certainly the leader, which is taking organic material. We at our landfills, we take all the organic material and we use that to fuel our fleet with our renewable natural gas fleet. We have the largest natural gas fleet using renewable energy probably in North America, reducing our emissions by well over 90% by doing that. We're using dairy manure, interestingly enough, as well, to create biogas to run our fleet, our renewable fuel for our fleet. So both from that, when it ends at the landfill, as well as when we divert it, we actually have systems in place that we are taking the food, turning it into a slurry that then creates a gas that you can capture that natural gas and you can create renewable electricity or renewable fuel out of it. So that's really where we're going. And I would say California is by far leading the way across the nation in that effort.
Thank you. So it's 12:30, so our time is up, but we're getting a bunch of questions online that I want to kind of ask you. One of them relates to COVID, and I sympathize with this question. people who suffered the most, aside, of course, people who were ill as a result of COVID, and of course, unfortunately, 200,000 plus Americans that we lost, but small businesses in particular. Small businesses during COVID, are already taxed with bunch of challenges. So the question is, how do we expect our small businesses to do all of the things we ask of them, recycling, et cetera, in this kind of environment? Is there anything policy-wise we can do or technology-wise we can do? Either one of you.
I'll just start out really quickly. I neglected to say this. The first thing that this is kind of interesting, and I should have said it earlier, Waste Management did in March was to tell our small commercial businesses they did not have to pay their next bill. So first thing we did was gave them a month's reprieve. And if you think about what that does, assuming they were paid up, if they ended up closing, we weren't going to bill them if they then weren't there, or if they took a reprieve or a pause. So it really gave them that chance of a month to figure out what they were going to be doing over time. So that actually turned out to be a great entree for us then to work with customers to help them adjust their service needs according to what they really need. And that's really important, is to make sure that we are providing only the level of service that they need and not charging them for anything else. And then I think from a policy perspective, I think California is going to have a challenge in terms of finding that balance of the cost of some of the to achieve some of the environmental goals, especially in the small business arena, in relation to really the economics of the times, and finding a way. There's some wonderful incentives for energy in California, low carbon fuel standards, et cetera. Probably some of those same notions of incentives may be important for us, in terms of driving our future for the right environmental performance, especially during COVID when times are so tight.
Frank, I want to follow up on that. This is really a tough issue.
Mm-hmm.
It's tough in any times. You mentioned COVID. All you said is COVID exacerbates this, because for most people, what we're calling waste is something that I don't have to pay attention to. It leaves. It's what I push out of my business. And for most small ones, they don't have the resources and the wherewithal and the bandwidth to do what Waste Management's doing in terms of thinking about this as new business. They have their own business. So this is really deep. It goes to every kind of environmental regulation we have encountered in California. Water is another one. When we went through this early on in the 80s and 90s about, water pollution controls on businesses. And we've done this for toxic emissions on businesses. These require on the ground, you mentioned local, education, cultivation, and help. And help is not just money. Money is important. Help is actually in the educational help and incentives game. And the state has not stepped up to that to the extent this will be needed. Doesn't mean that there's some good thoughts and good intentions, but every community has to be part of this. Now, part of this comes about, so there are some points of intervention. And you mentioned one when we began an hour ago. Contract negotiation with haulers is really but that's a community discussion. It's not the individual small business person. So you've got to take some responsibility as the public entities to negotiate on behalf of your small businesses. You expect every one of the small business to negotiate makes no sense financially or time-wise. So some things have to be done to accommodate them, not to tell them they have to change their lives.
Fair enough. The next question is about, by the way, Dan, coming back to what you said about water, you'll be happy to know that I volunteered you for another one of these. But this time, I'm inviting utilities, water, and waste. So it'll be a little broader than just the waste conversation. So you'll be happy to know. I'll let you know more about it soon. But
friend, Frank.
You're welcome. But the next question relates again to technology and other countries like Germany and Japan. The questioner asks, of course, that those countries have been extremely successful in use of technology in order to be able to divert from the landfill. So how are we, Susan? Let me start with you in the United States. What are we doing? Are we using those technologies? Can we use those technologies? Or do we have other technologies that we're going to be using?
This is a question. This is always a loaded question for me. So I always say Europe is not the US. And we also hear sometimes the best from Europe, maybe not the reality from Europe. So there's a couple of issues. One, I actually was just reading something yesterday. Europe's still exporting most of their plastic. So now as the Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries close down on what they're taking, they shift more towards burning it. And we don't do that here. So we have to understand that the notion of diverting often ends up with more waste to energy, which is not something the US has been historically interested in doing. Fact of the matter is, when you look at their overall waste stream, their recycling rate's not that much different than ours. It's about 2 to 3% better than ours. So that's part number one. And we don't get that whole story sometimes. I would say number two, some of our local communities do as good a job as places in Europe do. And we forget that. We're such a big country. We tend to look at the EU in its total, whereas it's a bunch of individual countries as well. And we have some places that do just as good a job as they do in Europe. And then number three, some of those places you referenced have very high disposal fees. $150 a ton is really very typical in some of those European countries. And those often end up with waste to energy or very expensive technologies that maybe don't meet some of the requirements that we have here. So I think that's important. And then my final one I will say is let's go to Japan and Taiwan. Japan, for example, has a very high diversion rate, but they have 11 different containers that they separate everything out into. And if you think we're going to do that on the West Coast, I think, I'd suggest maybe rethink that, as well as the fact they rely on waste to energy. And so they have very little land, very high costs, and very strong ability to regulate behavior in a way that, as we all know, in the US, we really value our independence and are not likely to take that kindly to tell somebody we have to separate everything into 11 containers. So we just have to recognize, I think in the US, we have our own unique set of challenges that probably put us in a different place. We have a lot of land that makes for cheap disposal, and we have a lot of competing interests on our finances. And every local government, back to your Frank statement, it's local. Every local government will make the decisions that's best for its community. And I think we value the ability to do that differently in the US.
I'm glad you said all those things, Susan, because I have said many, many times. I mean, I was raised in Europe, and I always say to people when they talk about Europe to me and give the Europe example, I say, well, the neighbor's grass looks always greener.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me just say this. First of all, I think that the penchant for regulating this kind of behavior is stronger in Japan and Germany and Europe than the United States. There's less indulgence of regulation of this kind of micromanagement of what you do with your materials. Second, a couple of just anecdotes. One is in Berlin, where I've spent many a day. I was struck by someone who was aghast at the way we throw things away in the United States into a container that mixes everything. And I said, well, how do you enforce that in Germany? And he said, well, we have apartment houses. Most people actually live in multiple housing units, and they're held collectively to doing it. So if they have garbage in what's supposed to be recyclable, the entire unit, the entire house or apartment house is fined, and they all pay for it. So they have this kind of collective enforcement. Some would call coercion. I don't think that would be indulged here. Second, in terms of our natural environment, I was most impressed several years ago hiking on the backcountry in Yosemite when I came across two young women from, happened to be Germans also, be European, who just small chat, they said, how do you keep it so pristine? And I said, what do you mean? Just, there's no garbage on your trails. I'm walking to this trail. People aren't dropping anything. I said, well, why do you bring that up? Just, well, where we're from, it just junk everywhere. So there's a matter of attitude and respect in terms of our environment, at least in California and Yosemite, that is not mirrored in some other cultures. But in fact, they do have rules in the urban area particularly that manage more tightly than we do. But I don't think that's our answer. As Susan said, 5, let alone 11 different bins would probably not work well in the United States.
Agreed. And that's something that that we always strive for. And as I said, education potentially might help that process.
You gotta look at
in all
upstream
of
and
us to be-
downstream.
Yeah.
Look upstream and downstream and go to the individual or the small business last.
Absolutely. And
Don't force them and bring them along.
yep, for sure. And you point out to also the cultural differences as well plays a huge role. You know, in Europe, for example, what you described may not be viewed as negative as it may be viewed in the United States, and vice versa potentially. So very, very important to make the distinctions. And that's why I always say to people when they talk to me about Europe, well, Europe is doing it. I go, well, yeah, but, you know, understand that it's not the same. I mean, it's very, very difficult to compare apples to oranges, which I think that's the comparison for the most part. I have another question, Dan. This would be for you. Is from, again, one of my former students who's asking the question, well, how can I get involved with the sustainability initiatives on campus?
Is a student on campus or they're alumni?
No, they're a student on our campus.
Hey, you got to email me,
Okay.
mazania@usc.edu.
Well, I'm going to put her in contact with you directly, no problem. And I'm sure she's listening. So
We have students on the President's Working Group. We have representatives from the undergraduate environmental organizations. We have representatives from the graduate schools, environmental organizations. We have representatives from the schools, 8 of the schools, from operations, from equity justice. It's a pretty diverse group that
Great.
make recommendations to the president. But there are students who are deeply involved at USC, and they just need to be in contact with them, and I'll facilitate that.
great. I will make sure that Hannah gets in contact with you. Now, I don't see any more questions, but that gives me a chance perhaps to say to each one of you, anything else that perhaps we have not addressed that you would love to address? We have a few more minutes to go. I think I covered pretty much the world that I needed to cover to make sure that this is helpful. By the way, I've been getting notes as we speak. Can we have this available to our community? And yes, the answer is this is taped and recorded. And this will be made available through our website. Ultimately, we have a wonderful communication staff that creates a shorter version of this, and we post the highlights, and then we post the entire video as well on our website. So feel free to disseminate in your local jurisdictions, which is the questions I'm getting from mayors and council members, whether or not this could be available to them and to their communities. And of course, it'd be our pleasure to help out as much as we can in the community.
I just have one closing comment. I think the problem is the nomenclature. We should stop discussing what we're talking about as waste or garbage. I don't know what to characterize it as materials, recycling. Of course, it's too vague. And I don't know the way of character. I know what we're talking about because it goes into, quote, a trash bin, but maybe it's actually a something else. I don't have the nomenclature, but as soon as you call it trash or waste, it's something that gets thrown away. And waste management maybe has to rethink about their labeling. It's not waste they're managing, it's materials management. And so I think you're in a materials management business, not waste management business. But that's because we have a changed paradigm, and I'm as much as anyone else in the old paradigm of calling it waste and then trying to justify not treating it as waste, as opposed to characterizing it as reusable material. That's what we said, circular economy or cradle to grave, whatever you want to do. We need a new language, nomenclature to discuss the new paradigm?
You're not the first person to suggest that, actually. The potential changing of the name. And I guess I'd like to mention next week we have a series that starts with Christiana Figueres, who was the lead for the Paris Climate Accord negotiations for the UN. She'll be speaking. We've been really trying to elevate this dialogue to a beyond waste dialogue, to really that climate change, global climate change dialogue. So she'll be speaking next week at an event that we've got. And then we will be having in February our sustainability forum, where we really try to promote thought leadership around the issues around climate change and the environment. And we'll have Project Drawdown, which is a really interesting dialogue around what we can all do to make an impact in reducing our carbon. So those two things I think will help also kind of build on this dialogue that I've been so appreciative to participate in today. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Those are available to Frank or the public he helps. Send him notice, and some of us can join in, or will listen in.
And Susan, just be on notice that I may volunteer you as well for our upcoming, that'll be in November, but just be on notice. Once I get a hold of people, I'm not letting go. So bottom line is, but this was a wonderful conversation. I want to thank you both for participating, and I want to thank you both for elevating the importance of not only the materials recycling topic or the circularity or the circular economy topic and the zero waste topic, but more importantly, thank you on behalf of all of my colleagues, both at USC and the Price School, which obviously cares very much about the policy component and the public administration component as one of the leading schools in the country on these topics, but also from wearing my other hat of mayors and council members and our audience, for the most part, for our program in local leaders who are always looking for great ways to serve their communities and certainly advancing, so to speak, this topic and helping not only their communities, but also helping climate change and being stewards of the environment, which I think everybody would agree. No matter, I always say to people that no one that I know of, no matter what political spectrum, wants to breathe bad air, wants to drink bad water, and wants to be endangering their children in an environment that is not suitable for human consumption. So that debate does not exist as far as I'm concerned. While there may be other debates about the political aspects of this, but what we're doing here is real. And at the local level, what we do is extremely important. So I encourage my colleagues in elected office at the local level to really pay attention to this, because what they're doing is really impactful in the larger scheme of things. Again, thank you both. I'm going to conclude here and wish you both a good day and look forward to the next opportunity that we see each other.